I'll be talking about mediation analysis in psychological research. I'll talk about what mediation is, why it is important to us, how we can conduct mediation analysis, what kind of a software we might use, and how we report the results. We say that mediation occurs when independent variable affects dependent variable through the mediator, the third variable, which we call the mediator. This is a scheme which is typically used to represent mediation. Now, why mediation is important to us? Imagine you studied how your independent variable predicts the dependent variable, and you found some kind of an effect. That doesn't answer a question how the independent variable affects dependent variable. You simply know that there is some kind of an effect. Mediation is valuable to us because it answers the question how. It investigates what is the underlying mechanism, how we can explain how independent variable affects dependent variable. Now let's consider this example. Imagine you're working on a study which investigates how deaf salience affects anxiety. Deaf salience involves being reminded about one's mortality or death. And imagine you found a counterintuitive result that deaf salience decreases anxiety. This might be hard to explain, to understand the meaning of this event, the underlying mechanism. Now, if you include mediation in your study design, this might help you unpack it. Let's look here. So in this example of mediation, deaf salience affects anxiety through the mediator, the belief in God. So deaf salience is our independent variable, anxiety is our dependent variable, and belief in God is our mediator. This relation between deaf salience and belief in God can be positive and it can be negative. What does it mean? In our case, it's positive. So deaf salience increases belief in God. Next, the relation between the mediator and the outcome is negative. Belief in God decreases anxiety. And this is how we understand why deaf salience decreases anxiety, because it's mediated, because of the mediator, the belief in God. This potential finding, can contribute in our theory, in particular terror management theory, studies the effects of deaf salience, the psychological effects of deaf salience. And this is how mediation can be very useful for developing and testing psychological theories. It's very important for us to understand how these mechanisms work, not just claim that there is an effect and it's positive or negative. What's also important to take into account is that mediation is also important to how we implement the knowledge we obtain. Let's consider this example. This is also an example of mediation. Here we have stress, which affects depression through self-esteem. It means that stress affects self-esteem. Stress decreases self-esteem, so there is a negative effect. And self-esteem in its turn, decreased self-esteem, increases depression. So this is how stress increases depression through self-esteem. This is a mediation. And you can use that information provided by mediation analysis in practice. Imagine you want to decrease someone's depression symptoms. And you know that stress increases depression. So you might suggest that we need to decrease the level of stress in our life so we can decrease the depressive symptoms. But that is not always possible. If we know that there is a mediator in the game, self-esteem, we might suggest we can work, using psychotherapy for example, to increase self-esteem. And this might help us decrease depression symptoms. That's why mediation analysis is important. Now, how we conduct mediation analysis, step by step. Here's our scheme with the independent variable, mediator, and dependent variable. First, we start with the path A. Path A studies how independent variable predicts the mediator. So in this case, mediator is the outcome. Basically, it's a regression model where independent variable is a predictor and mediator is the outcome. And again, this the coefficient we obtain here, the regression coefficient, can be positive or negative. Positive meaning that independent variable increases the mediator. So in our example, it was depth salience was increasing the belief in God. If this path is significant, we then go to the second path, B path. And this path answers the question whether mediator predicts dependent variable when independent variable is controlled. Now, why that independent variable being controlled is important? Because that allows us, the path B allows us to understand the unique contribution of the mediator in the dependent variable. And if this path is significant as well, then we can conclude that there is a mediation, because paths A and B are crucial. They constitute the so-called indirect effect. The indirect effect of the independent variable on dependent variable. We call it indirect because there is a mediator. And if that effect is significant, statistically significant, then we can conclude that there is a mediation. We can also calculate the so-called total effect. That's a combined effect of the independent variable and the mediator on the dependent variable. We can also calculate direct effect of independent variable on dependent variable. That direct effect differs in a way that when we calculate it, we control the mediator variable. So again, this controlling allows us to study the unique contribution of the independent variable to the dependent variable. But we are mostly focused on paths A and B because they compose the indirect effect we are so interested in. Because if it's significant, then we can conclude we have a statistically significant mediation. How can we do that? Well, we can use, there are different test statistical procedures to do that, but we're going to focus on bootstrapping because it's one of the best procedures we currently have. To do this, we can use SPSS. Andrew Hayes wrote a specific macros called process to do this kind of analysis. Apart from mediation analysis, it's also doing some other types of the analysis, but we are only interested in the mediation. So you access it, and then this window appears, and here we have to assign correct variables according to our model. In our model, depth salience is the independent variable, so we'll put it here, X variable. Anxiety is our dependent variable, so we put it here as Y variable. And finally, belief in God is our mediator, so we put it here in the mediator column field. And then we have to assign the model number. Here it's assigned to number 4 because in this software, model number 4 is the simple mediation model. You just have to remember that. Next, we have the default numbers for the bootstrapping method. Now, bootstrapping is the method we use to test our mediation. What does it mean? What does it do? So bootstrapping creates 5,000 samples out of your original sample. It takes your original sample and creates 5,000 combinations of elements taken from your original sample. For example, if in your sample you have 5 elements, A, B, C, D, E, it will create 5,000 samples out of it. For example, A, B, D, E, 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 B, C, D, E, and so on. And for each of these samples it created, it will calculate the indirect effect. Remember the paths A and B, that's our indirect effect. So it will calculate 5,000 indirect effects. And then it will calculate one and only confidence interval based on these indirect effects. And it will have a lower and upper bound. And if this confidence interval includes 0, then we can conclude that the mediation is not statistically significant, because 0 means that there is no indirect effect. So we can't conclude that the mediation is statistically significant. But if our confidence interval does not include 0, that means that the interaction effect, the mediation is statistically significant. So that's what we are interested in when we see the results. Here, first we look at the indirect effect of our independent variable on our dependent variable through the mediator. And we can see here that the confidence interval here does not involve 0. And it means that we can conclude that the mediation effect is statistically significant. In our case, that belief in God acts as a mediator between deaf salience and anxiety. Of course, we have to report this. This is like one of the most important parts in reporting this result. But simply claiming that the mediation is statistically significant, of course, is not enough. We have to interpret it meaningfully. Like, what does it mean that belief in God mediates, is a mediator? And to interpret it, we have to take a look at the regression coefficients of path A and path B. And so here we can see that path A has a positive coefficient. It means that deaf salience increases belief in God. And then increased belief in God has negative effect on anxiety. It decreases anxiety. And that's how we make sense of this complicated relation between deaf salience and anxiety. And that's it.